Hi, everyone. I'm Mercedes from Rocky Nook, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar on creative black and white opportunities with Harold Davis. If you have not purchased the book yet, you can do so today with code HDavis40, and that'll save you 40% off at checkout. That offer we'll post that up in the chat, and you'll also receive it in your email tomorrow when we send out the replay email. So I'll also say it again at the end, so don't worry, you'll have a few chances to redeem that coupon and be reminded of what that coupon is. So I'm just here to introduce you to Harold Davis, who will take over in just a minute. Harold Davis is the author of more than 15 best-selling books about photography and about the creative process. Currently, he lives in Berkeley with his family, and he also enjoys gardening. He continues to teach workshops and write books about photography. He also leads a travel group of photographers that get to go to really cool locations like Tokyo and Paris and learn photography from him there, and you get some access to some really cool locations for your photography on those trips. You can see more about those trips with Harold Davis on his website. So here with us today to talk about creative black and white photography is Harold Davis. I will let him take over from here. At any point during the presentation, if you have questions, go ahead and submit it to the chat. We'll hold all questions until the end, but you can feel free to submit them at any time. So Harold, if you're there, I'll let you take over.
Hi, everyone. It's really nice to see you here. My name is Harold Davis. And I'm a writer and photographer. I'm going to, since you're here to see my imagery and not me, in a moment I'm going to turn my webcam off and share my screen and open up a presentation of photos. So thank you very much. We will have time, I think Mercedes mentioned this, for a Q&A at the end of this presentation. So I look forward to answering any specific questions that you do have. So this presentation is about creative black and white opportunities. I've arranged the presentation to, roughly speaking, follow the organization of my new book, Creative Black and White Digital Photography Tips and Techniques, second edition. If you look at the presentation, you can see that this is, excuse me for 1 second, I see that my picture is up on the screen and I need to turn that off so that we have a better chance. There we go. The way I organize this book is in three major sections and one minor section. You can see those when you look at the table of contents, and in a moment you'll see a screenshot of that table of contents up on your screen. The first section of the book is about what works as a black and white subject and how you might approach it, where you might see opportunities, and that kind of thing. The second section of the book is about the mechanics of actually converting a color image, hopefully a raw file, into a black and white image. The third section of the book is about what you could do that is different and creative about black and white. How do you implement the vision that perhaps you understood in the first section? And finally, the end of the book has a fairly terse but hopefully helpful section on how to do monochrome and black and white photography with a mobile phone. The point here really is that each of these sections work together, that you need to have a vision and a pre-visualization of what your monochrome image is going to look like before you start to convert your image to black and white, and before you figure out what kinds of special techniques you have. So let's start by looking at what a monochrome vision might be. What makes a good black and white image? One thing that I look for when I walk out in the world and I say, is this monochrome or is this color, is the subject matter essentially black and white anyhow? Is there high contrast and lots of white and black and not very much in between? That might tell you right away that you have an image that works well for a monochromatic image. Essentially, I'm suggesting a process of pre-visualization, of trying to understand where you want to end up with your final image, implementing this in photography, and going ahead to post-production to convert it to black and white and then to apply special effects. I want to emphasize, and we'll do this a couple of times in this presentation, that the best place to be creative is the camera. I love Photoshop. Nobody loves post-production more than I do, and I spend a fair amount of my life in it. But if you can do something in the camera, that is your paintbrush, your tool, the best place to do it, and it's going to be a lot less effort than trying to change something after the fact in Photoshop. The image that's coming up on the screen is one of a workbench up in the Russian part of California. Believe it or not, there was a Russian part of California. And this is an antique workbench. The lighting on it is chiaroscuro, so it shows lights and darks. So here in the image, and I'm going to wait a second for the screen to catch up with me because I can see that it's not yet. In the image, you can see that there are aspects of this that are going to make a good black and white image without even having to think too far about, am I going to apply special effects to this image? What am I going to do to it? The same thing applies to many different kinds of images where you look at it and you say, this is a piece of art that can be an artificial art that is there in black and white. And by artificial, I mean that we live in a color world, so intentionally doing something in black and white becomes a kind of artifice in the sense that you're saying to people, this is art, this is something you should look at because it's special. The idea of walking down a foggy road in the country and seeing something that is there partly in the mist, partly disclosed, that doesn't have a high range from lights to darks, that is a nice sort of subtle image with a dirt road and eucalyptus trees on the right. This said to me, this called out, this said black and white. Now in post-production, I added some atmospherics, some light layers to add to the white, to the fog, but fundamentally the image was there, the composition was there. You can't change things like composition. When you look at an image like Ansel Adams made, some of the heroic black and white images from the mid-20th century, you can see an approach to black and white that says, this is an astounding thing. This is nature in all its glory. You can put it up on on a big print and make a nice print of it. You'll find a couple of places in my book essentially recipes for an Ansel Adams filter that you can apply in post-production to a landscape photo to create the kind of effect that Ansel did. This is, and the next image that you'll see on your screen is looking up at Antelope Canyon. I like to think that this image says that just because you have information about an area in a photo doesn't mean you have to use it. This was done using monochromatic HDR, which is one of the techniques I recommend for extending the opportunities in black and white. In other words, I photographed the image on a tripod with about 10 exposures, 1 EV apart each. So the question then, when you look at this image, you say, well, okay, Harold shot all this wide range of exposures. Why is the top black? Why is the bottom black? Why is the effect like a ribbon of light? And the answer is that when I processed it all and I saw the details on the top and the bottom, I looked back and I said, I don't really want to show those. Sometimes things are best not shown. So processing a image to monochromatic black and white allows you to monochromatic HDR, allows you to decide which parts of an image you want to show and which parts you don't. To make an image at night, like the next image that's going to appear on your screen, is in and of itself a kind of creative opportunity. The image you see is a 30-second exposure at Bixby Bridge, Big Sur, under a foggy night with cars coming on. If you stand by a pond in the autumn in New England and look at the colorful trees and the reflections in the pond, you say to yourself, well, you know, I'm only going to render this image in color. But an opportunity here is to render the same image in black and white and to let the viewer make the idea of a color image come into their own mind. So when you do that pond, you can say, wow, this is a real opportunity to present something in black and white and to imply color. One of the real principles of the creative opportunity in black and white is implicative color. You can think about what might be there if you don't do the color, and as opposed to if you do. Another creative opportunity in black and white at night is to photograph places that are otherwise full of tons of people with selfie cameras running all over the place, like this Piazza San Marco. And so when I did this at like 2 in the morning, the contrast of the lights and the buildings were great. I didn't have the advantage of the nice daylight on the images, but I was able to make the image without people in place. And finally, if you look at something like this grid in downtown San Francisco with the reflections of old buildings in the window, you're able to make a monochrome image that really shows the weird contrast between the antique shapes of the older buildings and the modern grid, which I personally don't like all that much, but that's a different story. Essentially, I'm recommending a kind of process where what you do is you try to pre-visualize an image and you say, this is where I'm starting. I'm going through my concept. I'm seeing the image. I'm recognizing it. I plan to make it, and planning is an important thing. You don't always stick to your plan, but you make a plan. You create the image, you process it, finally you edit it, you see if you like it, you show it, and move on from there. Black and white has great creative potential for images of people that you might not otherwise think to do. For example, with the next image that's coming up, you can see that there's a round black hat over him that's a solid disc of this Romani gentleman who was kind enough to sit for a portrait that I made. And similarly, with the next image, you can see that the gentleman with an extremely low depth of field black and white image was prepared to tell me a lot about who he was, just about the way his eyes looked at me, and he said, I want to show you who I am, but in color the image just doesn't quite make the same impact that it does in black and white. There's a great feeling you can convey about people in a black and white photo, whether it's as formal as the old gentleman with the eyes looking at you, or a relatively informal environmental portrait like the accordion player who is sitting there on the steps playing the accordion. Either way, you're able to use the black and white as a creative aspect and part of a kind of prop to the photo of the people to make them look more authentic and real, and perhaps, as in this photo of a factory worker in Romania, more gritty. The gentleman that I photographed by Studio Strobes next, you can see has on his torso tattooed 4 pictures of his babies. And so this shows here's a tough guy, but he has his kids on him. And the black and white of the monochromatic HDR image contrasts with the tenderness of the feeling about the kids. So here's a real opportunity to make black and white show its work. At the same time, this is one of my babies. This is my daughter, Katie Rose, a number of years ago. And the softness of the black and white here shows the way that you can create a sense of empathy and romanticism and tenderness right in a black and white image. Moving on, one of the things I've been experimenting with as a black and white opportunity in recent years is in-camera multiple exposures, where you set the camera to make multiple exposures in camera and use that as a part of a black and white image to convey some kind of statement about the person, if they're willing to admit to it, or at least a fractal effect on faces and on bodies as they move around the arena where the camera is photographing the subject. So there's nothing like an old-fashioned black and white portrait. And even if it's created somewhat artificially, you can have a sense like one of the multiple exposures, where it takes a fair amount of effort to figure out the exact placement of the model or subject and how you combine it into a photo. Or with this photograph of a model in Passy Station in Paris, where I photographed the 2 halves of the image differently. There's a great sense that you can use black and white to have a visionary effect that it's hard to get otherwise in portraiture. With the Nautilus shell, this is one of my images that's got about quite a bit. I was asked once to detail how I made this image. It turns out that I shot it on a light box, and the opportunity there was that I inverted in LAB color the background. So the process of inverting a black and white image to LAB color is one that's detailed in my book, and I'll show you a few more examples of it as I go along, but I'd like to refer you to that as a very simple, very fast way to potentially create stunning black and white images. Shadows are another place where you might well find a good black and white opportunity, as in this photograph of an everyday object, a cheese slicer. So if you see shadows, I recommend you look for that as a black and white opportunity. I think many of us have photographed dandelions and said this wonderful contrast between a really white dandelion in a macro world and the background makes for an interesting black and white composition. I would use this one here to say, look for high contrast for your black and white images. And as you run through the possibility of flowers in black and white, what I said at the beginning of this presentation, that the absence of color in the image doesn't mean that the viewer doesn't impute color to the image, is an important point. As you look through the ranunculus and the camellia that I've shown here, there's something about the depth of the form in black and white that creates a real visual opportunity. Looking at this one here, that's coming up, you're going to see an interesting transition of a flower on white to the same image shown on black. This is an example of an LAB L-channel inversion where the whites and black get flipped, and sometimes I like to call this a twofer because you get two for the price of one. Another possibility with black and white is to go for an extreme macro, like the image that is on your screen in a minute of a side of a glass bottle, which I photographed really close up. So I'm going to again make the point that perhaps the best black and white opportunities of all are in camera, particularly if you start with pre-visualization. You go to using the camera to create the image, and then you head on to post-production with the image in the best way that you would like to make it. The image you see on the screen right now is a succulent frond. So this is actually a fairly extreme macro with high depth of field looking straight down the leaf of a plant. So here's a black and white opportunity, the symmetry and depth of the lines going to a perspective at the bottom that is not very apparent necessarily when you looked at that. And if you did it in color, you'd lose the compositional approach to it and wouldn't be able to quite see the point of the image as much. So one thing that black and white does for you is it lets you emphasize whatever the point of the image truly is. Experimenting here with shadows and optics on a white background. So a lot of black and white imagery can be done with really simple household items. I showed you the cheese grater a while ago. Here you have just a glass cylinders on a white background, and when you do that, if you light it right, you can create something that essentially is grayscale, but otherwise a nice black and white image, or even a set of bowls, as shown here, cooking bowls, with a slice of a nautilus shell in the center. No Photoshop was hurt in the making of this particular image. That's a joke. The next thing to think about here is in contrast to most of the images that I've shown you that are high depth of field, this is a really low depth of field image focused just on the pistils and the flower. So black and white can create a great impressionist opportunity. I also want to look at the opportunity that exists in making motion appear to be frozen and longer. And in this coming up image of the great storm from Monhegan Island off the coast of Maine, where you've got water coming in at maybe a 2-minute exposure, and it makes it look like this endless storm. Or this from the West Coast, about a 30-second exposure, where the waves, the crashing waves on the coast of Marin, are made into this soft, almost watercolor-like thing. So the creative opportunities in post-production start with effects that are basically simulated from the old black and white chemical analog darkroom, such as solarization, which is in the darkroom. Solarization was the process of turning on the light when you were partly exposed, and it was a little bit hard to predict and control, but it could produce effects like the one shown on this slide. The point that I've been emphasizing about black and white opportunities for creativity is do it in the camera if you can. So in the camera, in photography, you've got in-camera motion, you've got high-key work, you've got extending motion. In post-production, there are a variety of possible effects, which I explain in my book, and I also give essentially recipes, step-by-step post-production ideas about how to do it. The book has sections on high-key, low-key, in-camera motion, monochromatic HDR, tinting, toning, the pinhole effect, LAB techniques, soft focus, solarization, the Karl Blossfeld effect, and also X-ray imagery, which is more or less just a fun thing because you need an X-ray machine to make X-ray imagery. Let's look at a few of these. Here's the table of contents of the third part of Creative Black and White, a second edition, coming up. Hopefully this is a little more legible on screens than the entire table of contents, which is a pretty detailed table of contents. Each of the sections shown here has directions and instructions for how to achieve this effect. This falls under the third part of the paradigm that I was suggesting, where you need to understand what makes a good monochromatic image and pre-visualize it. You need to process the black and white, and then you can add an effect in post-production of one or more of the things shown in the list. So an example here of this island coming up of a high key exposure, meaning basically high key is a fancy word, but what it basically means is that I've exposed so that everything looks bright and overexposed. It's a predominantly whitish image. Incidentally, the light in this image is interesting because it was shot at about midnight under a full moon covered by clouds. So this is a night photograph. Similarly, this pier coming up, Cayucas Pier in California, was shot toward the end, was photographed toward the end of a long day. But I have a prejudice against the verb to shoot when it comes to photograph. I much prefer to say to photograph, but sometimes I forget myself. In any case, this pier was photographed toward the end of a late afternoon, and I made it a very long exposure to give it an intentionally high key effect. So when you don't necessarily have to overexpose to create a high key effect, but you have to say, I'm going for a white background. So you have to use your camera controls and exposure controls to make sure that you have something that is essentially overexposed. The converse is true with a low-key image, which essentially is underexposed and is mostly black. So the interesting thing with a low-key image is that you can combine pinpoints of light in a low-key exposure, like the cabin on the beach shown, or like a bridge at sunset shown here. This is the backside of Bixby Bridge on the Big Sur coast, or like the Bay Bridge coming up at under a full moon rising with the lights on the Bay Bridge of San Francisco. In-camera motion or blurring via focus control is another essentially in-camera creative effect that if you control your camera right, you can use to great impact, like the focus controls on the image. The image, another approach here is to move the camera, as in this image, via a zoom lens or simply by putting the camera on a tripod and pivoting it and moving it. Sometimes a slight camera motion can make a sort of romantic effect, which is another possibility. So if you want to shake the image, as in this one, you can't really see it, but there's a happy couple in the middle of the image on the banks of the Seine here. And what I did was I had the camera on a tripod, I moved it slightly on either side of them and centered it on the image. So the couple is actually emphasized, but the image is not. Another approach, and this one is outlined carefully in my book, is to create a pinhole effect, and pinholes were the first kinds of cameras ever done. What happened was there was a camera obscura, which was a room basically which projected an image upside down through a pinhole inside of it, and people got the idea that if they could record what was done, they could create an image. So a pinhole effect involves a simulated pinhole effect involves brightening the center of an image, putting it all a bit out of focus because pinhole images are out of focus. And you can use a Gaussian blur for that in Photoshop, and adding a vignette to the side of the image. I do also think that black and white is quite effective on one's iPhone or other mobile phone. So I'm showing a fairly brief gallery here of imagery that I shot with my iPhone and processed to black and white, mostly using the Snapseed app. Coming back to the issue of using an LAB L-channel inversion to swap blacks for white and whites for black, a good place to look at this would be this black and white cookie, because it's pretty clearly black and white. This is a cookie that has got chocolate icing on one side and white icing on the other. So if you swapped it, and you get black for white and white for black. Here's a succulent that's on a black velvet cloth, and I applied, well, we'll get there in a minute. And if you swap the L channel out, you get a comparable image on a white background. Karl Blossfeld was a German photographer who lived approximately 1870 to 1930, and he started out as a worker in a metal factory where what the factory did was it fabricated decorative floral ironwork, and he was put on the mission to photograph samples for his for decorative ironwork. And so he ended up with these very close-up things, mostly with a sepia or black background. And it's fairly easy to simulate the post-production parts of this if you start with a photograph that looks like a Blossfeld photograph might have looked, like a close-up of a floral detail. So in my book, I give you the steps for creating the post-production of this, though I leave it to you as an exercise to create the image that might benefit from this process. Part of pre-visualization is to understand that not every process works well with every kind of image. But I found that I've had a great deal of fun creating Blossfeld effects on all kinds of images. I've shown you here poppies, a lavender plant, and a couple of other plants. Coming up in a second, you'll see a Queen Anne's lace, and I was both pleased and a little chagrined to find this image of mine created after Karl Blossfeld listed on a major art publisher's website as a Karl Blossfeld image. So beware of the internet, because sometimes things aren't exactly as they seem. One thing that you can easily do in post-production is decide to put a tint or a tone on an image. With very few exceptions, a black and white image is, of course, a color file, usually a RGB color file. That means that you can go ahead and put a tint on it, like the Brandenburg Gate here has a sepia tint shown on it. The easiest way to do that is to add a black and white adjustment in Photoshop or the comparable in Lightroom. Check the tint and tone box and choose what you want to add to it. There are a bunch of other ways to do the same outlined in my book, including selective toning, which would mean applying a different tone to different areas of a black and white photo, which you can do based on color range. For example, the color range of the rooftops of Paris shown here is different for the different images. I don't know why that one's coming in upside down. That's really odd. There we go. So toning and tinting is really a very easy and nice way to create special effects for black and white photos. The circumflex key shown here on this French typewriter is a low depth of field image, so that's one creative opportunity, and sepia has been added as it has to the vase shown in the image as well. So monochromatic HDR, which is also outlined via Photoshop, via Lightroom, and via third-party apps in my book, is a great way to add detail to black and white photos, to make the black and white images seem detailed, sharp, as in the motorcycle engine shown, the Antelope Canyon, and this image in the Imperial Gardens in Nara, Japan. The next thing you can do when you do monochromatic HDR and have the image data to process it is to make sure that the lights and darks are separated, and so that you can see a big color range and the difference between images that are like this bridge of light here shown along the Oregon coast, and near Cape Perpetua, this wave crashing in, or the church in Gozo coming up. Gozo is a island off Malta, which is part of the Malta archipelago, and this nice castle coming up in Romania. In other words, what you can do is you can create images that appear to be, quote, straight photos, but actually contain a lot more information and data and definition than is apparent when you look at them. And it's up to you to decide what parts of the image you want to include and what parts you don't want to include in terms of the brightness and sharpness and how you saw the image to start with. I'm waiting a little bit for the images to catch up with me, because somehow we seem to be stuck here a little. Well, I'm going to keep going even though I don't see it coming through. The bridges here show examples of both how to put a border on, which is another great black and white effect, and how to keep going and make your images look like they're very depth oriented and long. And you can make your skies look dark and lowering or foggy, and create interesting effects of darkness and light, and play with shadows on fog and caves, and create panoramas of mountains. Regarding X-rays, the point here is that you need an X-ray machine to make X-rays, and there's some dangers involved. So unless you're a radiologist or a technician and have access to this, you probably can't do this. But what comes out of a radiology photographic session, the way it works is that an X-ray machine puts an X-ray beam from a tube, basically through a plate, down onto a photosensitive material, these days a large sensor. So making an X-ray image is a lot like making a photogram. In other words, the X-rays going through it, depending upon the strength of the X-ray and the exposure. The resulting file is what's called a DICOM file. It's a medical format, and it can be opened in Photoshop. The technical issues of opening it tend to be that you've got a low resolution monochromatic black and white image. So you need to separate out the colors of the image and also enlarge the intensity and resolution of the resulting file. But it's really interesting to be able to show people things that you can't see with naked eye, because they're inside the given subject, not on top of it. And one thing that I've developed along with my colleague, Dr. Julian Kopfka, is a technique that combines exposures of the outside of images with the inside. So we're not really going to have a whole lot of time to get into that here, but the image that's going to come up on your screen in a minute of roses actually combines some of the exterior of these roses with the interior, such as a really great effect. To me, it looks a little bit like a starry, starry, starry night. There, you can see it. You can see here, in a minute, it'll come up in color, and you can see that what we've done is we've taken an outside photo of these roses, and we've combined it with the X-rays so that you have the inside and the outside of the flowers at the same time. And I'm about to wrap up this presentation and head to the Q&A portion of it, but I will leave you with a few thoughts before we go. A camera is an extension of ourselves, an appendage to bring us closer to the universe. One way that I think of that is that I use my camera to examine things, to ask questions about people, things, life. And another way to look at that would be to say, okay, it's an excuse for being any place. And being a black and white photographer is a double excuse, because not only do I get to go any place, but I also get to render it as I want to render it in shades of black and white and forget about the external colors. Common saying, want to take better photos? Stand in front of more interesting things. Really better photos? Become a more interesting person. Experimenting with things is what I love most about photography, is one of the things that I really love most about photography at any rate. I mean, there's so many things I love about photography. It's hard to know where to begin. But experimenting with things is great. That's what beginner's mind means to me, is that you're not scared to experiment because it's not like you know so much. If you can put a name on something, you can't really, it isn't really the thing. So there's something ineffable. The best imagery, the best photographs are ones where there's no clear name for something. There's something mysterious about the photographs. It's about the mystery. That's the most important thing. I have a Photographing Flowers for Transparency workshop in June of 2020, a trip to Tokyo in the autumn of 2020, a trip to Paris in April of 2021, which includes a visit to the garden at Giverny after hours. So I really like this. And I hope that you've enjoyed this webinar, that you have some good questions for me, that maybe you pick up a copy of my book and get some details about how to do some of the processes that I've explained to you. And I'm also going to put up a screen with contact information for me. I'm happy to respond to emails. There's a great deal of information on my website, including FAQs with a lot of the techniques and links to online courses and things like that. And you can see the information here. And I'm going to send this back to you, Mercedes, for the Q&A portion of this.
Great. Thanks so much, Harold. We have a few questions for you. So a lot of people had questions about, I guess, like your favorite things. So I'll start with one of them. And the question was about printing black and white. So what kind of paper do you like to use when printing your black and white images? And what kind of printer do you like to use?
So on papers, photographic papers for high-end printers these days are just wonderful. There are so many possibilities. I have to say that, in full disclosure, I have a business relationship with Moab Paper, part of Legion Paper, and they generously sponsored a lot of my work. So when I say that they make wonderful papers, it's absolutely true. I particularly like the metallic papers they make, Slick Rock, Slick Rock Silver. Juniper rag, Beretta rag is my go-to general purpose printing paper, and I also like some of the washi papers that they market in the United States. These are really wonderful papers. In terms of printers, I use a high-end Epson. I've also used the high-end Canons. I don't think there's a whole lot of difference between the printing quality between the two brands. I believe that Canons are a bit easier to maintain in terms of the printing heads not clogging, and I believe that Epsons have a little bit more access to software choices in how you deploy them. Thanks. Thanks for the good question.
Great. Here's another question about your favorites. The question was, who are some of your favorite photographers, and then more specifically, who are some of your favorite solarization photographers?
Well, with solarization, you'd have to look at Man Ray, basically, who more or less originated the genre, and he actually named it after himself. Like many artists, he's a bit of a narcissist, and no, I've never heard of that with an artist. Anyhow, he called them rayograms. So I'd say with solarizations, go have a look at Man Ray, because his work is just drop dead great. In terms of my own favorites, well, it's hard to knock Ansel Adams. I'm sorry, I know that's okay, and Edward Weston, they're just great photographers. And there's so many good photographers out there. Black and white working today, Michael Kennett's pretty good. I like his work a lot. Of course, there's always this photographer in Berkeley, Harold Davis. He's not bad.
And last one about your favorite things, then I have a question for you about the book, which is, what is your favorite camera and your favorite software to use?
Thanks. Oh, gosh, what are my favorite things? I should do a song and dance routine on this, Mercedes. I try to be pretty agnostic about favorite camera. I think it's Jay Mizell who has this great quote, "The best camera to use is the one you have with you." Currently, I'm working with a Nikon D850. It's a great camera. It's really, really superb. It's kind of, I think, almost the end of the line of classical DSLR field cameras. It's a little heavy. I get tired of lugging it around on things like the Camino Portuguese with lenses and a tripod. But, on the other hand, if that's the price I have to pay for being at places, it is, and it gives me enough resolution to make really big prints. Part of how I make my living is by making really large prints for a couple of different basically architectural kinds of clients, and so I need a lot of resolution in my cameras. I don't think I really have a favorite camera, in the sense that any camera people like using is good. The most important thing is to be really familiar with it. I mean, for me, I want a camera that will let me access manual controls easily, that shoots raw, and most high-end cameras do these things, so ultimately I don't care all that much. The lenses are perhaps more important than the camera, though, and there I really recommend experimenting with lenses and getting the best you can afford.
Yeah. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the difference between the first edition and the second edition of this book?
So first of all, this book is about 30% longer. The first book was 240 pages. This is 320 pages. This has given me a lot of space to put new material in. Most of the images are new. One of the things that I've learned over the years doing these books, and particularly in response to the first edition of the book, was that people really like detailed information about how specific images were made, what's the exposure data, and what's the story behind the image. So we made real efforts to include that in great detail on every image in the book. Because in fact, there are some people who go through the images, look how they're made, and look at the settings, and don't read any more of my golden words. I hate to say it. So we expanded captions, we expanded sections. I added sections on specific techniques, such as different ways to solarize. I show 3 different ways to solarize in the book, and the Blossfeld effect and other things like that. And of course, in the 10 years from the first edition, the software, Lightroom and Photoshop and so on, have changed a bit. So I updated the book for that as well as adding a section for black and white mobile phone photography. It's really, I mean, I like my first edition. My books are my children, and it's hard to say which is one's favorite. But this was a great opportunity for me. So thank you, Rocky Nook, for this, to turn what I think was a pretty good book into a really good book.
Yeah, thank you. So that's about it for the Q&A now. So I want to just thank everyone for attending and spending your portion of your afternoon or late morning, depending on where you live, with us. And thank you so much, Harold, for coming and giving us this wonderful presentation today. Just a reminder for everyone here that you can get creative black and white photography for 40% off on the Rocky Nook website when you use code HDavis40, all one word. So go ahead and apply that to your cart and you'll save 40% on creative black and white photography. And another reminder that tomorrow you'll be sent an email that includes that coupon code and also includes a link to watch the replay of this webinar in case there was any part you missed or any part you want to revisit and go back over. Thank you so much, Harold, and thank you everyone else for coming.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.